Aloha and welcome to our video on the Paleozoic Era. In this video we will discuss the kinds of environmental changes that were going on during this time which led to an explosion of life, and then we'll go through the various periods of the Paleozoic Era. Okay, so the Paleozoic Era is made up of several different periods, and these are what we're going to talk about a little bit. They range from the Cambrian all the way to the Permian period, and we can see that it went from about 542 million years ago to about 300 million years ago. Okay, so what happened during the Paleozoic Era? Well, back in the Cambrian period, about 500,000 years ago or so, what we notice is we have this invertebrate explosion. So it's called the Cambrian explosion, and that's where we had a more stable Earth environment, and that allowed life to start to explore, fill, and adapt to all these different niches. In the Ordovician period, we saw jawless fishes evolve, and we started to see the first vertebrates coming as well. In the Silurian period, it's noted that we had plants that started to spread on land, and then we also had amphibians come during the Devonian. And during this period of time, we also had many different fishes evolve, including the cartilaginous fishes, our sharks, and things of that nature. So in the Carboniferous Period, it's named that because that's where we had these large swampy forests. That is, they died and they layered out over time. That's where we formed most of our coal deposits. And then the Paleozoic Era ended with the Permian mass extinction about 248 million years ago. This is also the time that Pangea started to form, and it's also where reptiles started to become one of the more dominant types of animals. So how does environmental change affect what's living on the planet? Well, when we have a change in environment, it forces the animals to adapt to these new conditions. And when it does so, it puts different pressures on the animals, and that's one of the evolutionary pressures. Sometimes, however, these environmental changes can be drastic and sudden, like really large changes. When that happens, we end up with what we call a mass extinction, and that's where you have lots of different types of organisms dying off all at once. And our Earth's history is marked with a whole bunch of these mass extinctions, and we'll talk about one at the end of the Permian period. So the Cambrian period is, we keep going back to this is where we had an explosion of life. So this is where we had a stable environment, and we can see all these different living types that were evolved out at that period of time. We have our slugs, we have our insects, we have our shell mollusks, we have jellyfish. Most of the invertebrate types evolved during this period of time, and it was because we had invertebrates, but we also had new niches that were stable enough to allow life to evolve to fill them. Now, one of the things that allowed this Cambrian explosion to occur is we had a supercontinent, and that supercontinent broke up during the Cambrian, and as such, it created shallow seas in between the breaking pieces. So if we imagine we had one landmass, that one landmass separated into two landmasses, we had this narrow, shallow seas that were here, and those were warm water bodies, and that's where we saw a lot of this life explosion occurring. These new environments, like we said, they promoted new life and a massive explosion in life in only 15 million years. So we saw a whole bunch of evolution in a real short period of time, and that's why we call this the explosion of life. Now, the Ordovician period, we notice that we have this separation a little bit more. We can see we have one of these supercontinents, Gondwana, here, that was separated out, and we can see that we have all of these other pieces kind of moving away, and what it did is it created this ocean here, and this ocean was a warmer ocean, and that allowed this diversity to increase. We started to see jawless fishes evolve, we started to see some land plants evolving, and at the very end of this period, it's marked with one of our first mass extinctions. And we believe that that was either caused by a large ice age or by a volcanic explosion that would have put the dust out and would have just basically contaminated the atmosphere, and that would have caused a lot of issues. So in this graphic, I just wanted to show you what we're talking about with the Ordovician. We call it a new beginning. At the end of the Cambrian, there was a mass extinction, and most of these periods, that's how they were marked at the end. And what that did is that created new environments, and the animals that were able to survive were then able to adapt and evolve and fill these open niches. Now, during the Silurian period, we had a lot of reef building going on. We saw fish evolution continue. We also saw the formation of these guys here, the Euryptids. These were the beginning of arthropods. We had some before, but we can kind of see some other ones forming here. On land, we had the mosses start to develop, and those are our first vascular plants. And we also saw animals start coming out onto the land. So the Silurian, we kind of had not so much diversity, but we saw a lot of exploitation. We saw some evolution occurring, but it was basically, let's get onto land and start spreading out and start exploring that whole new environment of land. Now the Devonian period came, and at the Devonian period, what we saw new was this whole idea of a jawed fish. So now we had a fish that instead of it having a permanently open mouth, now they had jaws that could open and close. And speaking of jaws, this is also when we saw the evolution of sharks. So sharks have been around since the Devonian period. Mind you, they've evolved over time, but this is where we start to see the first sharks appear. We had reefs built out of sponges and corals. We started to see the first forests on land, and most of them were going to be tree ferns as opposed to like trees like we see now. So just really large, massive ferns that formed these forests. We also saw a rise in insects. We saw the first amphibians. And at the end of the Devonian, we had another mass extinction, and that mass extinction took out things like our armored fish. So like we mentioned, most of these periods were going to be started off with the end of a mass extinction, exploitation of a new environment, and it grows. We have diversity happening, and then we have a mass extinction at the end that marks the end of the period. Now, the Carboniferous period is actually made up of two different periods, the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian, but the highlight for these periods is that we had these coal swamp forests. Okay, during this time we had more of these plates spreading, we had some landmass collisions, but it was really these forests that give us our name. Okay, and what happened was as these forests, and you can see in the picture as the animals and the organisms and the plants died, they would fall down into these swampy forests, and over time, heat and pressure changed these into these vast coal beds that we now mine for coal to use for power. Other things that we saw were seed-bearing plants came to rise. We started to see some winged insects, and look here, we're starting to have now our first reptiles. So the Carboniferous period is where we laid down some of the world's greatest coal beds. Okay, so the end of the Paleozoic is the Permian period, and the Permian period showed us the formation of Pangea. We can see that here, and that's where all of these different land masses came back together to form that supercontinent. Our climate was warming. On land, we had the conifers, or the cone plants, and they became abundant. We started to see some mammal-like reptiles. So some of them had large sails and were able to regulate their body temperature, so we started to see some warm-bloodedness. And then at the very end of the Permian, we had the Permian extinction. And this one killed 96% of all species. So that's a mass extinction when 96% of the living things on the planet died at the end of the Permian extinction. Okay, that's it for our video. As always, good luck in the lessons and the quizzes, and we'll see you in the next video.